Participatory research, for me, I suppose, it is about trying to work as a researcher in a way that challenges and disrupts some of the more traditional distinctions between the producers of knowledge and the people that are having information extracted out of them. So it's about trying to challenge some of the established distinctions between the researcher and the researched. Co-production, I suppose, speaks to that, but I see it as somewhat different. So participatory approaches I see fundamentally as a question of challenging established power relationships. Co-production, I suppose, I see more in terms of a commitment to working in partnership to generate research outputs that involve generating ideas and evidence in a way that bounce off each other in a process. But I suppose the power aspect is there, but it's less in the forefront for me.
It comes back to quite a strong epistemological distinction in that participatory research is coming from sort of Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and it's a liberation process, and it's about deprivileging expert forms of knowledge, whereas co-production comes from economics and is not necessarily about deprivileging some knowledge, but it's about recognising the equity of all forms of knowledge and recognising that by bringing different forms of knowledge together in a production process, the outputs and outcomes will be greater, because you're bringing in more knowledge to that process. It's
the centrality of power, maybe, or the role of power in those distinctions. I mean, some of the work I've done around looking at experiences of early onset dementia was drawing much more on that sort of Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and particularly Augusto Boal and their Theatre of the Oppressed approach. So really trying to translate some of those theories around power and how power works into theatrical performance, and the notion of play, that actually we can use play. Play can be a very powerful way of challenging inequality in social relationships. So one of the things that I've done as part of kind of my own research, and this goes back a few years ago, working with a service that provided support for families living with early onset dementia, people with a diagnosis of dementia before the age of 65. But really trying to have quite fluid research relationships, so one based really on principles around public sociology and what Burrowoy would describe as a kind of organic public sociology, a process of sort of mutual education between researcher and the public that you're engaging with. But quite early on in that process, we decided to use some of that Theatre of the Oppressed methodology as a participatory approach for developing stories or vignettes. It's one of my particular interests throughout my research careers about using vignettes. We were able to bring in a theatre company, a participatory theatre company, to work with families, to say, well, let's use scenarios that we can start to explore together. I would see that very much as a sort of participatory form of research, as opposed, I suppose, to co-production. Yes, we produced something together, but what we are trying to produce, I think, ultimately was something that tried to highlight some of those collective experiences of discrimination, what it's like to be in a society where you live with dementia on a day-to-day basis. In a sense, we co-produced a set of vignettes, but for me, I suppose it was characterised more by its participatory flair.
Yeah. My own research, which I describe as more co-productive, and that was with a variety of community organisations in the neighbourhood of Wester Hailes in southwest Edinburgh. There were some very participatory elements to that. For example, a totem pole, which is a very small version of it, quite early on in the project. But then also through the sort of the process of co-production, came to a awareness that in some elements of the research, the outputs that the community partners wanted and us as academic partners wanted would be quite different. And so as an academic, I wanted a research paper. I don't think I have to be ashamed of that, so that's what you want to do as an academic. Whereas the community wanted a news source to help develop community activism within the neighbourhood. And by working in a research process together, we managed to produce those two outputs separately, and there was a trusting relationship to recognise that was okay, the fact we wanted different things. But the research was still characterised by a trusting relationship of co-production, and bringing the forms of knowledge we all had around the table enabled those outputs to be produced of benefit to both myself and the community partners.
Establishing that trust and rapport, I think, is so crucial. I think some of the work I did really kind of invested weeks, really, before we got anywhere near talking about taking part in research, of actually just being in that environment, being in that space, giving an opportunity for people to get to know you as a researcher, get to understand a little bit about your motives, very much try and suss you out, get a sense of, well, is this person genuine, when they're looking to do this sort of co-produced or more participatory work? Is this a bit of a tick box thing? In my area of work, I suppose, around dementia, those are very personal experiences often, and they're very emotive things. And before we could really get anywhere, that we could start really recording our data, if you like, building that mutual sense of trust and sense of belonging. Took a lot of time, but B was just so absolutely crucial. I was wondering, did you encounter the same thing?
And our partners had their fingers burnt with some previous collaborations with academics where the community partners ended up feeling used. It was a very extractive process. So they came into these co-produced research processes very rarely, but learnt a lot through it. And actually, it's one of my frustrations as a researcher is that a lot of the work on participatory methods and co-production talks about the importance of trust, and particularly from an ethical perspective, it's like you must trust each other as partners, but actually doesn't talk very openly and honestly about practical ways to achieve that. Going to local Asda to buy the lunch and make cups of tea for people and stuff like that. Really mundane tasks that are not in methods textbooks that are really important in showing that I can work with you, you can trust me, I'm not going to mess you around.
Certainly from my own experience, it's very easy to feel like, oh, am I doing something wrong here? My approach is much more messy. It feels more messy, or it feels more uncertain.
Yes.
And I think, talking to other people who do this sort of work as well, you realise actually that's quite a common experience, that you can sometimes feel maybe out of step with some of those quite polished accounts of co-production or participatory work. But it's feeling comfortable to be able to put your hand up and say, actually, no, that's not working for me, or that's not, I don't understand this, or this is actually what I want to get out of this process, and being quite upfront and honest.
For me, looking at it from a co-production perspective, it's important that's on both sides as well. We need to be prepared to be open and honest about what we're doing, and even if it's a misstep and you feel really cringeworthy about it. For me, I sort of go right back to my doctoral research interviewing people. But I remember a couple of the interviews where I'd sit down with these 60-year-old women community activists and get out my digital recorder, and they'd sort of look at them and go, oh God, they've shrunk over the years. And they've been participants in research so long, it's like they've gone from sort of reel-to-reel tape recorders to these tiny little credit card sized. I was there feeling very nervous, not really done many interviews, and they were very comfortable with the interview, could make that comment about the technology. So actually they probably had more power in that setting than I did as a researcher, and whereas in most of the sort of discussion about research ethics doesn't allow for that.
A lot of my work really has tried to treat consent, or particularly the latter work around dementia, as very much a continuous process, and something which the methods literature is increasingly saying there should be on a relational basis. There should be this constant monitoring and checking, regardless of whether or not someone has necessarily signed a consent form. But I've sometimes found that quite difficult actually to render into a format which traditional ethics committees recognise sometimes, particularly if that's NHS ethics committees, and obviously also being mindful of the need to show a certain governance and frameworks that participants are not being exploited, that there is notions of informed consent, quite legitimate concerns that an ethics committee is obviously existing to satisfy that the procedures are in place. I was wondering what your experiences are of sort of navigating that formal ethical approval process and just that doing ethics, on a day-to-day basis.
I sort of don't tend to work in health ethics committees, so I know they are particularly more rigorous, but in the university level, mentioning things like you think you'll be using these methods, but you'll be taking a co-produced approach, so therefore you'll be working with partners to develop a set of methods with these safeguards in place is enough. And it's also having that trust built up through the sort of co-produced approach enabled me to seek support from that wider network, so particularly from community development workers who have an approach to ethics is very pragmatic. It's like, what's the right thing to do in this situation? And they were really useful for me in helping me work that through and not leaving me sat at my desk worrying. Could actually reach out to them for help in working out what the right thing to do in these situations was.
So there is an element of the researcher has to step out of that comfort zone a little bit, be more open and honest and saying, I don't know the answer. I don't know how this is going to play out in its entirety. I don't necessarily know what the best way of doing this is. It's as much the researcher having that confidence or that ability to step back a little bit from that very controlled, linear approach to research of this is how it's going to go, and I'm going to control for this as much as possible. I've always found that quite an uneasy feeling, I suppose, stepping back and saying, I don't know.
Yes.
When I have done it, that's when you tend to get some really good steps forward in your research.
Yeah, for me it's those moments that leave the longer lasting legacy and to move it into kind of the contemporary discourse of modern academia leave the greatest impact. In the last research project, we were evaluating what the outcomes of those previous co-produced research projects had been, including one that had produced a totem pole. And one thing that was highlighted by the community partners was this totem pole has been erected in Wester Hale since 2012, and it's still there. West Hale is one of the most deprived neighbourhoods in Scotland. It's not been vandalised or burnt down. It's made of wood. So although our formal research projects have ended in the neighbourhood, it has this much longer lasting legacy in terms of its placemaking value. That messiness, that fact you don't know where things are going to go, for me, what is so good about participatory and co-produced approaches to research.
So you're producing something that is almost by definition owned by more than just the researcher, isn't it? There's an attachment to it that is more than just the researchers. Where I find particularly the influence of more arts-based inquiry, arts-based techniques being increasingly recognised within social science as ways of trying to disrupt some of those traditional divisions between the researcher and the researched, the researcher and the participant, in the sense, well, we are all researchers and we're all participants in a process of meaning making.
As soon as you move away from that idea that it's a very formal project that's structured in a certain way that would deliver certain things, your methodology and your methods become more fluid and open to new methods. They have to, just because what you're doing is about the process. It's not about the outcomes, it's about the process. The excitement of co-production is using that process to new ends. A good example kind of contrasts a bit with what you were saying was in the project I co-produced with civil servants. That was really interesting because we did use interviewing techniques, but what was different there was the subjects of our interviews that we were doing were academics who had tried to get academic evidence into policy making. And so it was me and a civil servant interviewing these academics. Having somebody who's not an academic doing that interviewing process with me changed those interviews completely, because they were coming into them quite ignorant of what our practices are as academics. So in that way, the good qualitative interview is a conversation rather than something very structured. They could chip in with the extra questions that will probably never cross my mind, because I presume I'd know the answer because I'm an academic as well.
One of the questions that I found myself thinking more and more is where does this process go now? Certainly, I think in my own field now, around dementia studies, maybe there's more opportunity for seeing people with dementia setting the question, and researchers being involved much more as facilitators of that process rather than necessarily the directors of it. But really, for the researchers taking even more of a step back, I suppose, and saying, well, how do we maybe crowdsource research questions? Researchers offering their more academic expertise to other communities in a way that then enables those communities to direct a research process to their own agenda or to their own ends more.
Quite a strong social justice element of we've got these resources, we should be using these resources to the benefit of wider partners. Even in little ways in my teaching, I'm now working with voluntary sector organisations for them to come up with, well, what do you want to know about? What do you need to know to do a better job? Rather than, I've got some really interesting problems going around in my mind. I'm an academic, that's what I'm paid to do. But are these relevant questions for organisations out there who are facing problems every day?
I suppose the promise of that is another generation of academics for whom this is very established ways of working.
I think as we do more of this, then the organisations we are working with will gain greater capacity to be able to work with universities in an effective way and get what they need out of universities. Going back to that sort of core principles of co-production, it's about both partners to the co-production process, learning and transforming through that process of working together.
And that shift much more towards a sort of more public engaged, public scholarship, public knowledge production, public academic work.
Doing impact properly.
I suppose when we started that discussion about what does participatory research mean, or co-production, mean? And these are often, the danger is they become buzzwords to pin on something, to give it an element of either excitement or to give it a sort of trendiness or to give it an acceptability. Whereas the doing it is the important thing. And that comes, I suppose, from that commitment to the process. Well, the importance of that reflexivity comes in, doesn't it? Being mindful of your own practice and how your own practice shapes and is shaped by the wider context in which you work.
The way studentships are now structured, you are expected to do much more than just that core project. And I think it's up to supervision teams to ensure that the research process has that time built into it. It's not an add-on, it's actually, no, this is what research now looks like.
Yeah.
We are training you to be the next generation of scholars. So as we shape your project and work out the project plan, you should have time within it to do these activities.
Yeah, I think that notion that this can be embedded within the PhD process itself is really important. So, we've been very much looking at, well, how do we mobilize this knowledge? That maybe there's knowledge that has been generated through a particular set of research activities, but then how does that translate into something like a resource? But rather than this being the end product, actually, how is this just another part of a cycle within a cycle, and actually really trying to embed that output as not tangential to the PhD, but an integral part of the PhD.
Yeah. With co-production being much more talk about a process, sort of participatory research is very much a normative commitment to being at that end of the process as quickly as possible, where your participants really are leading it. Whereas co-production, for me, is being on a journey towards getting there in the future, hopefully. I'd hope all PhDs, particularly if they're on a policy-focused area, have some element of co-production in them. You're not just there to extract data out of the people you're working with.
And I think even just having an impact on one individual as well, and one participant, in a research project who speaks to you as a researcher and says, actually, I really enjoyed, this process, and I really feel like I've learned something or engaged in that process. For me, that level of impact as well can be sort of immensely valuable, just as, if not more rewarding as a researcher than writing academic papers, as rewarding as that is as well.